Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Angela Wallwitz joined Sotheby's Munich in 1976, and after 2 years, she joined the European Ceramic Department of Sotheby's London. In 1984, she was appointed departmental director, and some years later, Angela became a dealer. She has participated in the Grosvenor House Antique Fair. She has also been invited by TEF of Maastricht from 1989 as the first porcelain dealer to be invited. And then Angela retired from full-time dealing in 2007. She has done wonderful discoveries. In 2004, Angela discovered the method of dating individual casts of 18th century Nymphenburg figures, and she published her discoveries in Weltkunst. And this publication formed the basis of Alfred Ziffer's chapter on that subject in the 2004 Bustelli exhibition catalogue. In 2006, Angela proved that Candler's designs of porcelain sculpture were driven by symbolisms in which were lost during the later manufacturing process from the second and subsequent work molds. And this information is published in Keramos. So we are all very eager to hear from Angela today. It's over to you, Angela.
Many thanks, Felix, and good evening to everybody, friends all over the world. No? What happens?
If you just click your screen.
Yeah, you would have thought so. Now it worked all the way now.
You just click on your screen and then use the arrows to...
No. Yes, here we go.
There we go, thank you.
Yeah. My journey to catalogue this historically most important object of my professional career let me discover the historical, philosophical, and art historical background which drove Johann Joachim Böttger to accept long captivity within and outside prison, lifelong financial hardship, and poverty at the end of his life. I realized that the stoneware manufactured before the founding of the Meissen factory in June 1710 can be differentiated from that made from the 12th of January 1708 onwards. I discovered the early steps of potting this new material, and most importantly, the reason behind the different surface treatments. I also learned to recognize the work of the man who helped starting the competitive Brandenburg-Prussian red stoneware factory in Plaue. The Kramalski red jasper porcelain garniture was purchased by the great art and ceramic collectors Lola and Siegfried Kramalski in Amsterdam between 1923 and 1938, from whom I could not discover. Siegfried Kramalski was 30 years old when he moved from Hamburg to Amsterdam and began his serious collecting at that time. In 1938, he luckily escaped to first Canada and then to America, and was wise enough to ship his entire collection to America on time before the Nazis arrived. And just to show the importance of these two collectors, the famous monster jug by Kirchner was part of this collection, and also Van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet, which was the most expensive work ever sold in auction for about 15 years. During my journey over the past 2 years to catalogue this garniture, to my great shame, I discovered the groundbreaking work of Ernst Zimmermann. We all own his 1908 publication, Erfindung und Frühzeit des Meissner Porzellans. But with 271 pages of small print and 721 invaluable footnotes, all referring to the archives in Dresden and Meissen, It is a hidden treasure for all non-German speakers. Ernst Zimmermann began his career in the porcelain world as an assistant curator at the Porzellansammlung in Dresden in 1898. 10 years later, he became assistant director, and in 1912, he became the full director. He worked both on Meissen, Chinese and Japanese porcelain. His knowledge was so famous that the Turkish government asked him to catalogue the Chinese porcelain in the Topkapi Museum. He retired in 1933. Most of my new insights were found in his publications, and I realized that at least Ingelore Menshausen and Rainer Rückert based their research primarily on Zimmermann's work and list of archival references. We must not forget that he was lucky enough to work with archives which had not been depleted by any war. And indeed, it was also Ernst Zimmermann who, in his wide, broad knowledge and education, had found the famous quote by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, which supported what I had suspected for a long time. The importance of BOETTGER'S discoveries far exceed what is usually seen only in relation to the beginning of Europe's craze for porcelain. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was a philosopher, mathematician, lawyer, historian, and political advisor. He lived between 1646 and 1716. He is considered one of the most important intellectual contributors of the early Enlightenment. He and his fellow philosophers based their thinking purely on reason rather than on religion, prejudice, and superstition. As such, the work of these philosophers was decisive for the development and support of scientific research, cultural and political progress. Madame de Pompadour was a fervent supporter of Les Philosophes des Lumières, and Diderot's encyclopedia is one of the best-known results of this philosophical breakthrough. Colbert's new economic theories grew from this zeitgeist and were copied by Augustus the Strong, and formed the basis also of Saxon's economic success, and ultimately led to this transgression from a workshop-based manufacture of works of art to a manufactory system which created works of art on a much later scale, which in the end, of course, developed into the making and production line of design objects. To achieve the artificial manufacture of gold, silver, and precious stone had been the aim of man for a long time. To think independently of the Holy Scriptures, or better to say independently of the rules of the Church, that started already in the Studioli in the Renaissance, but that formed the basis for the new theories of Leibniz and his colleagues. Man now dared to wish to recreate God's creations, and that is what BOETTGER did. Leibniz wrote in his Miscellanea Berolensis, published in Berlin 1710, the following: "The youth who brings back to life the hope, aspirations of all alchemists is Johann Friedrich BOETTGER." Alchemy developed in the late 1st and early 2nd century in Egypt and Greece. It is the research into the properties of the elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Aristotle added the principles of the contrary: warm, cold, dry, wet. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the natural philosophy was slowly replaced by chemistry, physics, and pharmacology. It is an error to believe that the making of gold was the alchemist's main purpose of research, although it is in any ruler's interest to improve his state's finances by being able to make gold. Gunpowder and medicine, however, played a much bigger role in the alchemist's work. Augustus the Strong's ancestor, the Elector Augustus I, who lived between 1526 and 1586, had a keen interest in alchemy and indeed claimed to have been able to make silver. He had a laboratory in his Residenz in Dresden. His passion was shared with several European monarchs of his time. With these historical facts in mind, Augustus II's interest and prolonged willingness to invest large sums into Böttger's work were hence not just a fluke of the fluke of a vain absolute ruler. And please note, looking at this picture, which is in the Gemäldegalerie in Dresden, Teniers depicts an alchemist working in a laboratory which is filled with ceramics. Up to the 19th century, I believe man created intentionally or unintentionally only 4 materials. Glass around 1600 BC in the Middle East, paper around 100 AD in China, and then later again in 1100 in Europe. Chinese porcelain around 1000 AD, and then Böttger's red stoneware in 1708. The 5th man-made material is plastic, which was invented in 1860. Facts which might help to rekindle the passion for porcelain. Böttger's invention of stoneware, the red jasper porcelain as he named it, on the 15th of January 1708, when he wrote to the king to announce his invention, did not disclose his reinvention of white porcelain, which he discovered only 2 weeks later. It is obvious what extraordinarily important these discoveries are in the history of the modern world. Some works of art in this material, especially the early ones, reflect the symbolism of the early Enlightenment and should not only be seen as, at the best, objects for the Kunstkammer, but understood as true works of art rather than fine craft. On the 24th of October, 1705, Böttger is moved from his prison in the Jungfernbastei to the left here on the screen to the Albrechtsburg in Meissen. Although it is very confusing because several kilns existed in the Jungfernbastei and only one kiln at the time was not even ready and was finished by 1708 in the Albrechtsburg. So the manufacture of Böttger stoneware was at least done in 2 places, if not in 3. In May 1707, Dr. Bartholomä, the private personal physician of the king, was sent to Leipzig only to look for new inventions. On his travels, he found yellowish white clay and the red clay, which was then used by Böttger. In his announcement to the king, he called his invention red jasper porcelain, because Böttger had claimed to be able to make gold. He failed, but he was able to make man-made semi-precious stone, one of the biggest assets to the Saxon economy. We all know these pictures. And I was even allowed to touch them in the vaults of the Meissen factory some years ago. According to Zimmermann, Böttger was much prouder of the invention of his stoneware than that of his white porcelain. And indeed, he withheld his discovery of the recipe for white porcelain from the king for almost a year. And this is because he considered it as a reinvention only. And this is why we all think he discovered white porcelain in 1709. The difference between red stoneware and Böttger stoneware and Chinese or Japanese stoneware lays in the purity of the clay. And you can see very clearly these extreme enlargements of the paste, the Chinese paste on the upper part, and the much finer distribution of the particles on the lower part of the screen now. When fired with oxygen, Böttger's clay had a much higher iron content to start off with. And as I said, was made in a much finer consistency. And when fired at a large, very high temperature with the addition of oxygen, a paste was created which was harder than any other ceramic paste ever before. Depending on the temperature of the kiln and the lengths of the firing, the colors of this clay changed from ochre to lighter red and increasingly darker red until it became black, the so-called Eisen Porcelain. However, the skill of potting luxury vessels had not reached Saxony by 1708. The fine ceramics made in Delft for already 20, 30 years, and in Frankfurt, Hanau, and Berlin, were a far cry from the potting, the peasant potting in Saxony. The Saxon court potter Fischer was the first employed potter working for Böttger, but not very successful. In 1709, Peter Eggebrecht arrived from Berlin to Dresden to apply for the privilege to open his own faience factory. Zimmermann describes Peter Eggebrecht's visit to Böttger's workshop, where he potted several fine objects in one day, when single objects had taken several days to be completed by Fischer. Where Peter Eggebrecht learned his craft is not really known. We only know that he had worked in the Funke factory in Berlin before coming to Dresden. And his 1718 dated apothecary jar, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum, shows not an amazingly refined eye for proportion and skill of hand. Even the still a little wobbly looking pair of Wohlbeer vases on the left, dating from 1700 to 1710, show a higher skill. So who was actually, how did Böttger achieve to make thousands of finely potted pieces between February 1708 and the Leipzig fair at Easter 1710? It seems that no design for form pieces existed at the beginning, but that molds were taken from silver, stone, and possibly also wooden objects, and of course, Chinese porcelain. And indeed, the silver jug depicted on the left, which is part of the Wilanov collection, clearly shows the relief on its silver original. But not only that, the silver maker's mark is clearly visible on its base. On the right, you see a Plaue jug, which must have been made with the same technique. The relief clearly refined after the air drying process. Only Jeremias Spiller, one of Böttger's first employees, could have witnessed the technique of taking a mold from silver objects, and later copied it in the Plaue factory in Prussia. With his infallible instinct, Zimmermann groups stoneware together on this photograph without having written about the technique of taking molds. If we look at the jug here, clearly a silver shape, but there's no applied decoration, but the relief shown from the mold taken. Just spilled my glass. And here we see even the seam of the mold. And I would like to draw your attention to this beautiful object. And please remember this section. We will see it later on. The arrival of Johann Jakob Irminger at the workshop of Böttger cannot be dated precisely because he worked on and off. He helped out. He was the court silversmith and originally came from Switzerland, had troubles there, had to escape from Switzerland, came to Saxony and became court silversmith relatively quickly and became one of the most influential craftsmen in the workshop and in the factory of Böttger. Irminger's technique, however, is clearly different to that from before. Initially, he uses existing shapes and applies acanthus leaves and other details from silver objects, masks, and other relief motifs. His full-time employment with the factory began with the opening of the Meissen factory in June 1710, by which time he was, of course, designing his own pieces. But this example, I think, shows very clearly the early days of Irminger. On the left, a vase in the Porzellansammlung in Dresden, clearly of Chinese form, unpolished. You see all the marks of the potting, and here you add a European silver lid, which of course is aesthetically not at all acceptable. Irminger has it polished. It turns into red jasper porcelain, but the acanthus leaves are very clumsily positioned, and the mask really has no function at all where it sits, but it's at least better than the collar, the laurel wreath, which then ruins the entire line of the vase, but at least he adds a properly fitting silver lid. The two examples of Saxon hard stone goblets show clearly that Saxon semi-precious stone was an important influence on the early Böttger wares. When this goblet was made in Böttger stoneware, we all automatically attributed it to Irminger. But actually, since the form not only existed in hard stone, but also in wood, and the lid here even suggests ivory, an ivory original, there is no reason at all why not one of the other 8, if not Peter Eggenbrecht or one of the 8 other formers who worked at the Böttger workshop by by the end of 1708 was responsible for this. And indeed that shape without this form, but without the lid, was then later appeared as part of the production of the manufacturer's factory of the 1990s. The fashion for red stoneware died quickly in Saxony, but not in Baden-Baden. And one of the early serious collectors of early Meissen porcelain was Sibylla Augusta of Baden-Baden. And when she built her little palace in Rastatt outside Baden-Baden, she had the ceiling painted with these red stoneware vessels, or at least the vessels, not recognizable shapes of stoneware, but at least red. Her collection in Rastatt includes not only I Ching vases, like the hexagonal vases on the console table on your right, but also black lacquer, to which we come back later, and of course white porcelain. The extensive collection of red stoneware of her fellow collector in Gotha, Herzog Friedrich II of Saxen-Coburg-Gotha, includes this hexagonal vase, which has traditionally been attributed to Plaue. But if you remember that vase in the Zimmermann, it really does bear a resemblance to this design. Other red stoneware ceramics existed before BOETTGER, but were fired at a much lower temperature. I agree with Errol Manners, the best expert on the history and symbolism of red stoneware. I agree with the thought that these unusually large hexagonal vases should be dated before 1700. However, they seem to be in the same spirit in proportion, or in the view of proportion, than the Berlin vases. And funnily enough, they even copy a detail of the silver smith's work by adding a gadroon onto the edges of the shoulder, where in the silver vessel, traditionally the material wears rather thin, and that's why the silversmith added these gadroons. The most important influence on form was, of course, Chinese porcelain from the Royal Collection in Dresden. Objects of Asian form were part of the first shipment to Warsaw, but they were all of minor finesse and form. Looking at the form and surface treatment of the Kamarski bottle, it is obvious that the shape was taken from the blue and white Chinese original in the collection of Augustus the Strong, as shown here to the left. Calculating the shrinkage explains the somewhat uninteresting gradation of the sizes of this garniture. You might not remember it from the first slide, but we come back to it at the end. But why did BOETTGER adapt the Chinese form into a shape which resembles an apothecary jar? BOETTGER and Zimmermann regarded polished stoneware as the most desirable and highest ranking form of decoration. Lead-lined polishing wheels were used to achieve a luminously shining surface, to emulate semi-precious stone. This process required great skill and was very time-consuming. In the wake of the wave of fakes during the 1990s and early 2000, a Meissen collector purchased a modern Chinese tea bowl in red stoneware and polished it with his modern DIY machine. It took him 60 hours to achieve such brilliance. With this, it becomes obvious as to why, in the very early days of making red stoneware, Böttger employed in 1708 5 potters, 1 engraver, 1 gilder, 1 lacquerer, and 19 glass polishers. Steinbrück writes an important reference which let us evaluate the so-called Jasper porcelain. In the comment of a Portuguese merchant who had purchased polished wares with a value of 300 thaler in 1711 and sold them immediately for 900 thaler, and said afterwards the success was due to the fact that Jasper porcelains were particularly rare, as one could not obtain them from India, China, or Japan. Augustus the Strong was so impressed with the surface treatment, it allowed no faults in the paste, no faults in the firing or the decoration. He decreed on the 12th of October 1710 that red jasper porcelain was to be made only for royal use. Already in 1709, he had given orders to continue the Roman tradition of medal making, commemorating state visits or historic events. However, in Augustus the Strong's case, it was most probably Louis XIV's example of giving gold medals to visiting royals, which led him to this decision. The tradition was that the host would cast a medal in gold for the visiting royal. The silver medal was polished. The silver medal was given to the ministers, and the bronze medal was given to the lower diplomats. Böttger, or rather Augustus the Strong, if you look at the top left, commemorates the visit of Frederick IV of Denmark in 1709 to Dresden. The unpolished raw Böttger stoneware medal represents the bronze version for the lower ranking diplomats. On the top right, you see the polished medal here that would reflect the silver version. And with the discovery of a gilt polished medal, the only one known, in the collection of the Danish kings in Schloss Friedrichsburg, it became obvious what Augustus the Strong's intentions were. Contrary to his idol, Louis XIV, however, he did not depict himself on the medal, but the guest. These medallions are further proof of the evaluation of this new material and the symbolic significance of its surface treatment. The black glaze was invented in early 1710. To all my professional life, the lacquer glaze was considered the most superior of all surface treatments. I cannot recommend highly enough Zimmermann's description of archival evidence and his insights, which he publishes on pages 75 to 82. He quotes Böttger, albeit being very proud of yet another first invention, that the black glaze was particularly useful for covering firing faults. Engraved Laubenbandelwerk on Böttger stoneware is rare and beautiful. Sadly, all my efforts and those of 2 art historians in Dresden to find the graphic sources for the chromatography garniture failed. Before, I had concentrated on armorial shields, but now this technique of decoration, I realized, formed a group. The teapot on the left, incidentally, was once owned by Caruso. And the teapot on the right is now in the private collection in Chicago. During my research, trying to find the source of these engravings, I looked at glass. And indeed, I found a small tumbler in the collection of the Bayerische Nationalmuseum in Munich. And indeed, Rainer Rückert had attributed the decoration to a Jeremias spiller. When Errol Manners suggested that the Gramarsky garniture could have been made in the Plaue factory, I had to start my research anew. And again, 1908, Zimmermann not only published his big book, but he also published the first comprehensive article on the Plaue factory. And together with the findings of his contemporary art historian Gustav Edmund Patzaurik, I could assemble a fairly detailed biography of the glass cutter Jeremias Spiller, who was born in 1681 and buried in Plaue in 1738. He is the only glass cutter who have worked both in Dresden and Plaue. The art historian Gustav Patzaurik described the Bohemian glass cutter Spiller as a previously overlooked and particularly gifted craftsman. Rückert found a salary receipt dating as early as September 1708 in the Böttger workshop. He earned 3 thaler per week in the Porcelain manufacture, Böttger's porcelain factory, so-called porcelain factory in the Jungfernbastei. He was the first glass cutter who received instructions and training to decorate Böttger's red stonework, red jasper porcelain from the goldsmith Johann Jakob Irminger and the potter Christoph Krombolz. He seems to have specialized in Laub- and Bandelwerk after engravings by Paul Decker and Jean Bérin the Elder. Unfortunately, I just could not find the real source. Spiller again is recorded as one of the 29 glass cutters in the list of employees in Meissen on the 5th of August 1710. The number of employees explodes after June 1710. He's no longer listed in 1712 because in the meantime he had escaped from the Royal Saxon factory in Meissen together with a potter to help establish the first Prussian porcelain factory in inverted commas in Plaue an der Havel, south of Berlin. The museum in Schwerin owns this rather big sugar box. To call it silver of silver origin would be difficult, but you can see the little flowers, the gold, and a little bit of Laub- and Bandelwerk, albeit rather primitive here. The Porzellansammlung in Dresden owns another one, which is definitely much finer shape and certainly resembles other Meissen sugar bowls. The engraving is rather primitive, and the enameling even more so. It is also catalogued as Plaue in the Porzellansammlung in Dresden. When I had the Gramarsky garniture paste tested in with the XRF method, and luckily Katharina Hanschmann allowed the Böttger and possibly Plaue objects in the Sammlung Schneider in Lustheim to be tested with XRF. But unfortunately, there is no difference at all between the two clays from a scientific point of view. I had also tested with XRF the colors and the gilding of the Gramarsky vases, but and the colors match exactly the colors of Martin Schnell. And the gold is so-called Dukaten gold, molten gold coins. So completely original. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any color testing on Plaue pieces. So that is still an unknown area. But of course, Jeremias Spiller could have taken colors with him when he fled from Saxony to Prussia. Each of the jars in the garniture was engraved with a large cartouche, in Bérain style, if you want to say. And beneath the German royal crown, which cannot be identified to any particular royal. The enameling of the flowers, eagle heads, and other details must have been done by the lacquerer Johann Christoph Scheffler before Johann Calbert added the silver, which is now tarnished in black, and the gilt decoration. Such definite attribution is possible as the form of the garniture can be dated so precisely, and only these two craftsmen were working then for Böttger in that capacity. A number of Böttger stoneware tankards and teawares, polished or with black lacquer clays, show similar armorial cartouches. For the very first commercial presentation of Böttger stoneware at the 1710 Easter Fair in Leipzig, the inventor sent several glass cutters along to provide the service of carving individual coats of arms into these cartouches. However, there was no demand. Today, most examples known in historical modern collections show blank armorial shields. This should be explained by the king's intended use of Böttger red jasper porcelain as diplomatic gifts, but the fashion for white porcelain, of course, put an end to this idea. The two medium-sized vases of the Kamalsky garniture show an inscription. You can see here the inscription Lehm, which means clay. In 1993, Rainer Rückert published in the German art magazine Weltkunst a vase which also formed part of the collection of Lola and Siegfried Kamalsky. And again, we see the direct influence of Chinese porcelain. And to the left and right, variations. You've seen the vase on the left before. I just wanted to put it all in one row. The highly polished, very slender vase on the right is in the Metropolitan Museum. But Rückert's reason for writing a long, erudite account of the earliest works by Böttger, all based on Zimmermann's references, is the inscription on its base. The center vase has an inscription which reads, Das erste vom Böttgerchen, the very first of Böttger. Hardly believable. The second of the medium-sized vases of the Kamalsky collection, garniture, shows this inscription, also in ink, added with probably a pound sign here and numbers. This label does not refer to a sale. It's an inventory sticker for the estate valuation when Mrs. Kamalsky died. The Rainer Rückert could not establish if the inscriptions of his vase dated from the 18th or 19th century. And when I had the ink tested with the XRF method on the Kamalsky garniture, the only thing which could be found out was that the ink consisted of gallos, and it could not be dated. I asked a handwriting specialist to look at the inscriptions, but he agreed with Rückert that they could either date from the 18th or the 19th century. The inscription on this vase is hardly legible, but indeed, I think that here is an A, and then one can't see anything, and then there is a TUS, and then there's a gap, and then there is definitely an R. That is definite. It's a mystery which cannot be solved with certainty. But the fine potting, the exceptional polishing, and the finest of engraved decoration known, enhanced with silver and gold, all point to a royal connection. How come that such an outstandingly important garniture remained unpublished until today? The reason might be in BOETTGER'S intention for its purpose. The Royal Saxon Court Pharmacy was founded by Augustus I and his wife Anna, Princess of Denmark, on 5th of May, 1581, with the intention in this sequence to further the health of his subjects, the aristocracy, and the court. Princess Anna of Denmark was one of the very first female chemists. She had arrived from Copenhagen with the Danish Royal Apothecary and, dedicated to chemistry and medicine, established her own laboratory outside Dresden. We remember that her husband had his laboratory inside the Residenz. They were assisted by Martin Luther's son, the medical doctor Paul Luther. Because of her experiments with and the use of the rarest natural specimens, her Renaissance Wunderkammer became famous. And she, from this Wunderkammer, she created the first royal court pharmacy in the Residenz in Dresden. She furnished its interiors with the finest silver containers. Alas, most of them were melted down after the 7-year war and replaced with pewter. The Royal Pharmacy in Dresden was described in all guidebooks of the 18th century, in all guidebooks of Dresden. In 1777, Benjamin Weinert describes the second room of the Royal Pharmacy. On one side of the room can be seen a fair quantity of red porcelain invented by the Baron von Boettger, made as various containers. Nobody has ever seen any red stoneware apothecary vessels, boxes. None. Not in Gotha, nowhere. Not in Warsaw, nowhere. We don't know what happened. But the Royal Pharmacy was Europe famous, just as was the Royal Pharmacy in Naples. But it is obvious that with this quote here, that a lot of Boettger red stoneware was part of it. I believe that the chemist and alchemist Boettger, he was a chemist, he was a trained chemist, sent the Gramarsky garniture of apothecary vases, not to the Porcelainsammlung, not to the Green Vaults, but to the Royal Saxon Pharmacy in the Residenz. And so the circle closes in the symbolism of the early Enlightenment. The Royal Saxon Court Pharmacy continued to be a center of scientific studies until King John sold it in 1857 to a Dresden chemist. In the meantime, it actually had moved out, it had been moved out of the residentials itself and moved into the Palais Korsel next door and then into town in 1857. When this chemist died, the contents and its original founding charter of the 1581 charter of the founding of the Royal Pharmacy, all was sold in a sale, in an auction in Dresden. Nobody knows of it, and the catalogue could not be found. I believe that the middle vases of the Kamarski garniture, as well as the single vase, unpolished, was inscribed at that point and sold together with the rest of the content of the Royal Pharmacy. And hence, it did not form part of any royal inventory, and also together with the Royal Saxon Pharmacy in the residentials, it was forgotten. It was forgotten also when the rebuilding of the residentials was planned in the 1990s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. That was captivating, solving or trying to solve this mystery. I'm sure we all have enjoyed very much this. I was just waiting for the next episode almost. So it was very, very captivating. Thank you very much. Before we move with the Q&A session, and I see that Errol is joining us now, I just wanted to make an announcement for our next meeting. That is going to be our online annual general meeting. So it's going to be done online like last year. And it's going to be on Sunday, the 12th of June at 5:15 London time. It's going to last about 45 minutes. So we welcome all the FPS members to join this AGM. And then we will share a different link for the lecture that follows the meeting. And if you can go to the next slide, Angela, please.
Oh, I don't have it.
Oh, that's fine. No worries. That's okay.
I don't have it.
So
I only have two.
That's okay. So thank you. The AGM is going to be followed by the Sir Geoffrey de Bellaigue annual memorial lecture, as always. And this year is going to be Meredith Martin, who is going to be talking about the Ballet de Porcelain, and we will hear about this wonderful initiative that she has put together. So we will share more information about that lecture soon, and the link is going to be shared with everyone for the lecture, as we always do. It's open, free. That's one of the magic of the FPS Zoom lectures. So now let's go back to Angela and Errol, and let's start our Q&A. I don't know, Errol, if you want to start making any remarks or making a question for Angela.
Well, first to just, you can hear me, I hope, and
yes.
Thank you, Angela. That's shone a really fascinating light on one of the most important, and I think certainly to the English-speaking world, least understood areas of ceramic history. And I'm thrilled that you flagged up Zimmermann, who is, I've been struggling through his texts recently, and he's becoming fast one of my great ceramic heroes. And so many questions. I didn't know this Leibniz quote, which I'm sure I should have, but where was he? Where was he? I mean, had BOETTGER'S fame by that period, 1710, really traveled to, where was he, in Berlin at this period?
No, Leibniz was Leibniz was in Leipzig before he went to Hanover and Brunswick.
Right. So he was
close by, physically close by.
Right. But he still took this chap seriously as a sort of a natural philosopher and an important figure, which that alone is fascinating.
Actually, Leibniz did not consider him a philosopher. He considered him an alchemist, a most serious alchemist. In other words, a very serious scientist.
Yes.
That's, I mean, I always thought that alchemists were a little bit sort of shady quacks, but that's not at all right.
No, I mean, I always think of von Tschirnhaus as the modern man of science, and Böttger coming from this earlier tradition. He studied with Zorn in Berlin, and you know, good pharmacists, but I never really thought of him as quite the modern man of science. But you think otherwise?
Do you mean Tschirnhaus or Böttger?
No, Tschirnhaus, I think of a modern man of science, traveling around and being a member of the Académie Française.
I don't think you can make a differentiation between the two. I think they're just different people and with a different, you know, emphasis. And obviously, it's a huge omission to leave Tschirnhaus out of this whole entire lecture. But then this was about the early manufacturing process and not the process of inventing.
Yes.
The invention. That's it's difficult because otherwise you talk for hours.
Yes, and I've also read that part of the impetus for Böttger to discover these high-fired stonewares was his search for crucibles that could cope with the high temperatures required for some of his experiments, and that led him to explore sort of high-firing pieces. Is that something? Does Zimmermann talk about that, do you think?
Well, yes, there are endless pages on that. I thought it was, for us, from an art historical point of view, more important to understand that he was proud of having made a man-made semi-precious stone, which, you know, so far no man could recreate a creation of God.
Yes, he's doing God's work. And
yes, and that was very much in it. They wanted to understand the world. I mean, it all started then. They wanted to understand fauna, flora, everything. You know, the stars had been explored for a long time. It was
yes,
a huge step to, and that's the reason why he called it red jasper porcelain.
Yes. It's frustrating that your XRF analysis hasn't been able to differentiate between
Plaue and yeah.
Because you know, Zimmermann, who probably had access to more material than you know, we do on a regular basis, he thought he could sort of tell the two apart. He said they were very, very similar, but he did say that there was a sort of more imperfections, a little bit of coarseness. But I haven't really been able to observe that.
I don't think that the clay is really worse. I really don't think so. It's as we have seen, making interesting forms is difficult.
Yes.
And if you have worked with Böttger and with Erminger, as Jeremias Spiller did, and with Eggebrecht, why do you then create a clumsy sugar box like that?
Yes, but
why? I mean, at that point he should have, but then he's not a potter.
And who are you talking? You're talking about Samuel Kempo. Who are you?
I'm talking about the difficulty of potting an elegant object.
Yes,
and that was not achieved clearly by the time that Spiller engraved the sugar box, which is in
Augustus says,
not Schleswig, but
I think Zimmermann quotes Augustus, said when Böttger, I think he goes and buys some pieces of Plaue at the Leipzig fair and shows them and brings them back as sort of specimens. And Augustus the Strong says, you know, something along the lines that the material is just, as far as he can see, the material is just as good, although Böttger's saying it's not. But it's clumsier, it's not as well formed.
Yeah, we all lean on that quote.
Yes.
And indeed, it was Eggebrecht who was, no, it was not Eggebrecht. It was one of the other famous potters, I forget who it was at the moment, who was actually sent on an espionage mission.
Melhorn, wasn't it?
Melhorn, you're right.
Yeah, yes.
And he and somebody else was sent to Plaue in order to sort of check it out, because they were also very worried that if they could possibly also do white porcelain.
Yes, that's an astonishing episode. It would make a film. He was sent
Yes,
there with
indeed.
his family, and he escaped and came back and revealed all. Another question. Well, so many questions. The gilded plaque in
yes, in Frederiksborg.
And where is that published?
It's good question. Good question. I think, in fact, I can't remember. I have to check it. I can't remember where it was published, but it's amazing, because that really really makes the theory.
Yes, I don't recall seeing that, and no,
it is there.
The Portuguese merchant, where was that? Who bought Steinbrück, yes. So he quotes the Portuguese merchant as making a swift profit in 1710 or something. 1711.
Yeah.
And before I will, one other question. I couldn't catch, you said one of the Krematsky vases had the word, was it lehm? Lehm,
clay, L-E-H-M.
Oh,
the two middle vases, the two middle-sized vases have an ink inscription underneath, just like the single Chinese, if I call it that, a vase with the first of BOETTGER.
Yes. Felix, now I think we have some questions. In fact, I've got them. I can. We have Pamela Rediti is saying, did Plaue produce anything other than a red stoneware body?
No, not to my knowledge. But then this was not a Plaue lecture.
No, but a black glaze.
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah, they did a black glaze like BOETTGER. And that's those pieces that Zimmermann publishes, and he says they were in the Kunstgewerbe Museum. I don't know what was that. I'm not sure which museum. It's not the modern Kunst. Is it the Märkisch?
It is.
But it was in 1908. The current Kunstgewerbe Museum didn't really exist.
Did it not?
I thought not. I thought there was the one in the Eastern Bloc in somewhere around Potsdam, and then there was the Märkisches Museum. Those pieces are not known. They're lost, I think, aren't they?
Well, there's a modern illustration of the quote unquote silver pot I published next to the silver jug from Wilanów.
Right. Yes. I'm looking.
Indeed, I think I might have skipped, out of nervosity, the importance of the Wilanów collection. Because of course, many more BOETTGER stoneware pieces are in Dresden in the Porzellansammlung, but the pieces in Wilanów are clearly datable because they were made before April 1710.
Yes.
And that's why it's so important.
Yes. And the pieces in Denmark are also datable to pretty much the same period. Yes, but there are
actually not so many.
Yes.
Not so many. That's the thing.
Yes. Now someone is
indeed, they're later. Yes. I mean, the delivery date is much later. The delivery date, I think, to Denmark is 1712.
Is it? Yes. I'm sure you're right. Someone is also asking, were pharmacy vases sold on the Leipzig fairs?
Not according to Klaus Bolz.
Yes, so
he lists the only source I know of what was in Leipzig.
And he lists everything in the Leipzig warehouse.
Well, a lot. Yes, he lists what he lists. Yeah, and possibly.
Klaus Bolz is. I think he was the first person to say it, as far as I know, that actually the firing of BOETTGER stoneware ceased in 1713. But is that absolutely Are there exceptions? I believe there are some.
How can I know?
No.
In the end, how do you know?
Yes, I have in mind some of the great pieces in Dresden. I have at the back of my mind.
The glass coolers and all that.
Yes,
But
yes, those incredible.
When you think, I mean, there is no fact.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. But when you think, how many pieces were made after having mastered the first step of potting, it was to my great surprise that in Dresden, in Saxony, there was no art of potting. When
there was something of a stoneware tradition, wasn't there?
An enormous stoneware tradition. I mean, very refined and wonderful. But that was, of course, 100 years earlier, and not quite, but 50 years earlier. But nothing in terms they didn't have any potters. And there was chaos, apparently. Well, according to Zimmermann, there was chaos in the workshop. Yes.
Yes. Another question, actually, this is a general question. Someone's asking, can you recommend a recent survey of Meissen porcelain with good cover of the origins? Actually, someone is crying out, we're crying out to have someone write the good basic introduction to the subject. It's in English, it's hardly been done since Honey. And he was only copying Berling. Who was Zimmermann's predecessor, wasn't he? I mean, there's a good book on Meissen.
But what about? I mean, didn't Maureen write?
She's written. There's been great works and fragile diplomacy, great papers on aspects of it. But I don't think there's a. I'm quite often asked.
Version of Honey.
Well, you want Honey's Dresden, China is still actually
a wonderful book.
A good book, but it is, when you start reading it, it is transcribing Berling practically sentence by sentence.
Is that the case? I've never read Berling cover to cover. But
well, if you put them side by side,
a lot. I mean, Honey was a great art historian and a great connoisseur, but of course, science and has moved on. I mean, we know so much more, and we can look at it from. Well, look at Maureen's, take on diplomatic gifts.
Yes,
complete new frame of understanding.
Absolutely, and these things are hugely important steps forward. But they're hardly an elementary introduction to the subject. It's a sort of that's what we need. Not an elementary. We just need a really good general introduction and. Someone, perhaps you should write it.
Good idea.
And has Angela's recent research been published? I think is the last question.
No.
Well, that's easy. Not yet. Presumably, we will in the French Porcelain Society.
It is. I need to obtain permission to do that, because of course the garniture is on the market now.
Yes,
of course. Great. Well,
not for me. Not for me.
No.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you very much, Errol. This has been fascinating. I'm sure that all of us, we have learned a lot about this subject, as Errol said, not that well known in English, and it has been completely captivating the way you have told us the story. So thank you very much to you both. It was fantastic.
Thank you, and good night, and have a good dinner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela.
And we hope to welcome everyone again in a couple of weeks' time for our AGM and our annual lecture. Stay tuned and have a great evening. Good night.
Bye-bye.